Hey everyone, welcome back to Cerebrella. Today's story takes us from a working-class neighborhood in Rome all the way to the highest office in Italian politics. This is the true story of Giorgia Meloni, told through the documented record. Let's get into it. In October of 2022, a 53-year-old woman walked into the Quirinale Palace in Rome to be sworn in as the 55th Prime Minister of the Italian Republic. Photographers crowded the courtyard. Headlines were already being written in a dozen languages before she'd even taken the oath. She was, by that point, already a first in Italian history, the first woman ever to hold the office of Prime Minister in a country that had existed in one form or another for over a century and a half. But that fact alone barely captures why the world was watching so closely that morning. Because the woman standing in that courtyard had spent her entire adult life inside a political tradition that most of post-war Europe had spent decades trying to distance itself from. She led a party with roots tracing directly back to a movement founded by former supporters of Benito Mussolini's fascist regime. International outlets, from CNN to the Associated Press, were that same week running headlines describing her as a far-right leader, taking power in one of the founding member states of the European Union. Her supporters told a different story entirely, of a self-made woman from a working-class Roman neighborhood who clawed her way, without family connections or inherited wealth, to the very top of Italian politics, and who was finally giving voice to millions of Italians who felt ignored by decades of political establishment. Both of those stories are, in their own way, part of the same record. This is the story of Giorgia Meloni, not a verdict on her politics, but an account built from the documented facts of how a girl from the Garbatella neighborhood of Rome became one of the most closely watched political figures in the world. Garbatella. Giorgia Meloni was born on January 15, 1977, in Rome, Italy. She grew up in Garbatella, a working-class district in the southern part of the city, known historically for its close-knit, distinctly Roman character, the kind of neighborhood that shaped a particular unpretentious identity in the people who came from it. Her early family life was marked by absence. Her father, Francesco Meloni, left the family when Giorgia was a child, and by most accounts, he later moved to the Canary Islands. She was raised primarily by her mother, Anna Paratore, alongside her older sister, Arianna. This detail matters to how Meloni herself has framed her own story over the years. She has repeatedly described her upbringing as one shaped by a single working mother, without financial cushioning or political connections, a narrative she would return to again and again throughout her political career, as a way of establishing her distance from Italy's traditional political elite. At the age of 15, in the early 1990s, Meloni made a decision that would define the entire trajectory of her adult life. She joined the Youth Front, the youth wing of the Italian social movement, known by its Italian initials, MSI. This detail is one of the most consistently discussed and debated aspects of her biography, and it deserves to be stated plainly and accurately, because both her critics and her supporters return to it constantly. The MSI was founded in 1946 by former officials and supporters of Italy's fascist regime in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, it existed for decades at the far edge of Italy's political spectrum. A home for those nostalgic for the pre-war order, operating under Italy's post-war constitution, which technically banned the reconstitution of the fascist party itself, but allowed the MSI to occupy an adjacent political space for nearly 50 years. A 15-year-old Meloni entering that world in the early 1990s was joining a movement with an unambiguous ideological lineage. From street politics to national politics. Meloni herself, in later interviews, described her early political motivation less in terms of nostalgia for the past and more in terms of concern over immigration and a sense of Italian national identity that she felt was being eroded. Themes that would remain consistent throughout her entire political career, largely unchanged in substance, even as the party structures around her shifted repeatedly. In 1994, the MSI formally rebranded and reorganized itself into a new party, the National Alliance, or Alleanza Nazionale, led by Gianfranco Fini. This was, in Italian political history, widely understood as an attempt to modernize and move the party toward the mainstream conservative right, distancing it somewhat from its most overt fascist-era associations, even as critics argued the transformation was more cosmetic than substantive. Meloni transitioned along with the party, becoming active in Azione Giovanni, its youth wing, and rising steadily through its ranks. She was elected president of that youth organization in 2004. Her first major elected position came in 1998, when, at just 21 years old, she was elected as a counselor to the provincial government of Rome, a post she held until 2002. It was an early sign of the organizational skill and public speaking ability that colleagues and journalists would repeatedly point to throughout her career, a directness of communication style that stood out even among more seasoned politicians. Her national breakthrough came in 2006 when she was elected to the Chamber of Deputies, the lower house of the Italian parliament, at the age of 29. 2 years later, in 2008, Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi appointed her Minister for Youth in his cabinet. At 31 years old, this made her the youngest government minister in the history of the Italian Republic, a genuinely notable milestone, and one that established her quite early as a rising figure within Italy's broader center-right political coalition, well before she would go on to lead a party of her own. Building Brothers of Italy. By 2012, Italy's political right was fragmenting. The National Alliance had, several years earlier, merged into a larger coalition party under Berlusconi. Meloni, along with several colleagues, made the decision to break away and found something new. A party called Fratelli d'Italia, or Brothers of Italy, a name drawn directly from the opening words of the Italian national anthem, a deliberate signal of the nationalist identity the party intended to project from the very beginning. At first, the new party was a minor player in Italian politics, polling in the low single digits for years. Meloni became its president in 2014 and has led it continuously since. What followed was, by most measures, one of the more remarkable rises in recent European political history. Not through a single dramatic breakthrough, but through years of steady, patient growth, as Brothers of Italy positioned itself as the most consistent and least compromising voice on the Italian political right, particularly as other center-right parties entered and exited various governing coalitions. The party's core platform centered on several consistent themes: skepticism toward the European Union's authority over Italian national policy, opposition to what the party characterized as uncontrolled immigration, an emphasis on traditional family structures, and an assertive, sovereigntist framing of Italian national identity. Political scientists and outlets like Britannica have consistently described the party's roots as neo-fascist in origin, even as Meloni herself has repeatedly and publicly rejected that specific characterization, describing her politics instead in terms of conservative nationalism. The party's rise accelerated dramatically after 2018, as Italy's traditional governing coalitions repeatedly collapsed and reformed in the country's characteristically unstable parliamentary system. Brothers of Italy remained notably the only major party that stayed out of Mario Draghi's national unity government formed in 2021, a choice that positioned it as the primary opposition voice heading into the next general election, and one that, in retrospect, proved to be a significant strategic advantage. The 2022 election. In September of 2022, Italy held a general election following the collapse of Draghi's government. Brothers of Italy, running as part of a broader center-right coalition alongside Matteo Salvini's League and Silvio Berlusconi's Forza Italia, won the largest share of the vote of any single party in the country, a stunning transformation for an organization that had been polling around 4% just 8 years earlier. On October 22, 2022, Giorgia Meloni was sworn in as Prime Minister of Italy, becoming the first woman ever to hold that office in the country's history. International coverage of the moment was extensive and, characteristically, split along familiar lines. Outlets like CNN and the Associated Press described her in their coverage as a far-right leader taking power in a founding EU member state, and noted the vigilance with which many of Italy's European partners were approaching her government. Domestically, and among her supporters internationally, the framing was markedly different, emphasizing her historic status as Italy's first female head of government and her promise of political stability after years of short-lived, revolving-door Italian administrations. Both framings, it's worth noting, were factually grounded rather than purely rhetorical. Her party's organizational lineage genuinely does trace back through Alleanza Nazionale to the post-war MSI. Her election genuinely did make her the first woman to lead the Italian government. Neither fact cancels out the other, and both continue to shape how her premiership was covered throughout her time in office. Governing Italy. Once in office, Meloni's actual governing record turned out to be, in certain respects, more complicated than either her staunchest critics or supporters had initially predicted. On foreign policy, she positioned her government as a firm supporter of NATO and maintained continuity with Italy's existing commitments to Ukraine following Russia's invasion, a stance that surprised some observers who had expected a more disruptive approach to Italy's traditional Western alliances, given the more Eurosceptic rhetoric of her party's earlier years. At the same time, she remained a consistent and vocal critic of what she characterized as European Union overreach into national policymaking, particularly on matters of immigration and fiscal sovereignty. Her government pursued a notably hard-line approach to migration across the Mediterranean, including agreements with North African governments intended to reduce departures, and later in her term, an arrangement to process some asylum claims in Albania rather than on Italian soil, a policy that drew both significant domestic support and considerable legal challenges within the Italian and European court systems. On domestic social policy, her government pursued restrictions related to same-sex couples and surrogacy, consistent with the party's long-stated emphasis on what it terms traditional family structures, policies that drew sustained criticism from LGBTQ+ advocacy organizations, both within Italy and internationally, and equally sustained support from more socially conservative segments of the Italian electorate. By 2024, international assessments of her influence had shifted noticeably. Forbes ranked her as the third most powerful woman in the world that year, and she was repeatedly listed among the most influential global leaders more broadly. Recognition that reflected not just her domestic position, but Italy's role within the G7 and the broader European political landscape, where her government had, by that point, proven considerably more durable than several of Italy's recent predecessors. The person behind the office. Away from the parliamentary chamber, Meloni's public identity has always been closely tied to the working-class Roman background she frequently invokes in speeches, a contrast she has used deliberately against the more traditionally elite backgrounds of many Italian political figures who came before her. She has one daughter, born in 2016, with her longtime partner at the time, television journalist Andrea Giambruno. The two were together for roughly 8 years before separating in 2023, following the broadcast of controversial off-air recordings of Giambruno that generated significant domestic media coverage and criticism, ultimately contributing to his departure from on-air television presenting. In 2021, before taking office, Meloni published a memoir titled Io sono Giorgia, I Am Georgia, which became a bestseller in Italy and laid out, in her own words, the personal and political narrative that would define her campaign the following year. A self-described outsider, shaped by a difficult childhood and a working single mother, positioning herself against what she frequently characterized as a disconnected political establishment. Colleagues, journalists, and international counterparts who have worked alongside her have consistently pointed to a few recurring traits: a direct, occasionally combative communication style, unusual staying power within the notoriously unstable world of Italian coalition politics, and a level of message discipline that allowed Brothers of Italy to grow, methodically, from a minor party to the largest political force in the country over the course of roughly a decade. There is no single, tidy way to summarize Giorgia Meloni's story, and that's largely the point of telling it accurately, rather than simply picking one side of it. She is, factually, the first woman to serve as Prime Minister of Italy, in a country whose political history had, for over a century and a half, been run entirely by men. She is also, factually, the leader of a party whose organizational roots trace directly back to a movement founded by former fascist officials in the aftermath of the Second World War, a lineage she has spent much of her career being asked to explain, defend, or distance herself from, depending on who's asking. She rose from a working-class neighborhood in Rome without inherited wealth or family political connections to become one of the most closely watched heads of government in the world, a rise built, according to the documented record, on decades of unglamorous, incremental political organizing rather than any single dramatic moment. Whatever judgment history eventually settles on regarding her policies, Both her critics and her supporters generally agree on one underlying fact. Giorgia Meloni changed what was considered possible in Italian politics. For a party that started just over a decade before she took office as a minor faction polling in the low single digits. The rest of that story, how her government will ultimately be judged, what her legacy will actually become, is still being written in real time in the country she now leads. And that's the story of Giorgia Meloni's rise to power. If you found this breakdown informative, hit subscribe for more true stories from the world of politics and history, and let me know in the comments who you'd like us to cover next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.